Thomas, a black farmer with hands hardened by years of tilling the soil and skin kissed by countless sunrises, parked his battered pickup truck in front of the Central Airport's luxurious airplane showroom. His boots were caked with dried mud. His faded checkered shirt bore the marks of hard labor, and his worn-out cap shielded a man with dreams larger than life. Today was special. Today he intended to purchase his own private jet, a lifelong goal born from decades of hard work and determination. As Thomas stepped inside, the showroom gleamed with opulence. Jets were lined up like sculptures of modern art, their polished surfaces reflecting the brilliance of overhead lights. But as awe-inspiring as the aircrafts were, the stares from the room's occupants were sharper and colder. Salespeople dressed in tailored suits exchanged knowing glances, customers whispered in hushed tones, and judgment radiated from their eyes. "What's he doing here?" a woman murmured to her companion near the reception desk. "He looks like he just walked off a farm." A smirk, followed by laughter, rippled through the room. Thomas could feel every gaze scrutinizing him, questioning his presence. Yet, despite the oppressive atmosphere, he straightened his posture, his resolve unwavering. He wasn't there to be accepted by them. He was there to claim what he had earned. His attention was drawn to a sleek, elegant jet in the center of the display. Its polished metal glistened like a beacon of hope. Stepping forward, he gently ran his hand along its surface, feeling the culmination of years of sweat and sacrifice. For Thomas, the jet wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of his success, a declaration that his hard work had paid off. But his quiet moment of admiration was interrupted. A young salesman, Greg, with slicked-back hair and a confident stride, approached him. Greg's smirk was laced with condescension, his tailored suit exuding a sense of superiority. "Excuse me," Greg began, crossing his arms. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is an airplane showroom, not a tractor supply store." Thomas turned his gaze toward Greg, his expression calm but firm. He said nothing, choosing silence over retaliation, but his presence alone was a statement. He belonged here just as much as anyone else. Unfazed by the lack of response, Greg stepped closer, his tone sharper. "Listen, this isn't a place for sightseeing. Do you even know the price of these planes? Or are you just here to dream?" A few customers snickered from the sidelines, their whispers growing louder. "Looks like he's lost," someone quipped. "Probably thinks this is a charity giveaway." Thomas clenched his fists momentarily, not in anger, but in an effort to maintain his composure. He had faced prejudice before, but it never failed to sting. However, he reminded himself why he was there. This wasn't about them. It was about his dream. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a used car lot," Greg added, his smirk growing wider as the crowd's attention shifted fully to them. Thomas finally spoke, his voice steady. "I'm here for that jet," he said, nodding toward the aircraft he had admired earlier. The room fell silent for a moment before erupting into mocking laughter. The disbelief was almost palpable. Greg shook his head, unable to hide his disdain. "Right. And I'm here to buy the moon," he scoffed. But Thomas didn't flinch. His dreams were too big to be crushed by the weight of their prejudice. He turned away from Greg and walked toward another employee, intending to get the information he needed. "Still not leaving?" Greg sneered, following him. "You should probably save your time and ours. People like you don't belong in places like this." This time, Thomas stopped and faced Greg, his voice low but firm. "I have every right to be here," he said. "You don't decide what people like me can or can't do." The intensity in his words silenced Greg momentarily, but the room was still filled with smirks and judgmental stares, as if the crowd awaited a moment for him to falter. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke through the tension. "Thomas? Is that really you?" Turning around, Thomas saw James, an old high school friend, striding toward him. James was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The stark contrast between the two friends was evident, but there was no judgment in James's eyes, only warmth. The two embraced, and for the first time that day, Thomas smiled. James's presence was a breath of fresh air in an otherwise stifling environment. "What brings you here?" James asked, his tone light but genuine. I'm here to buy a plane, Thomas replied simply. James's eyes widened in pleasant surprise. That's amazing, he said, his voice carrying an undertone of admiration. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But their reunion didn't go unnoticed. The crowd's whispers shifted, now focused on James as well. Looks like he brought backup, someone muttered. Thomas glanced at James, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. It's hard to ignore their stares, he admitted quietly. James placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Let them stare, he said firmly. You've worked hard for this moment. Don't let their ignorance define you. Thomas nodded, his confidence rekindled. Together, they continued toward the jet, their heads held high. But the battle was far from over. For Thomas, this was more than just a purchase. It was a stand against prejudice, a declaration that dreams were not bound by appearances or judgment. Thomas stood beside James, his gaze fixed firmly on the jet he had set his heart on. Around him, the murmurs and snickers of the crowd persisted, cutting through the air like needles. Yet he remained rooted, refusing to let their disdain shatter his resolve. In the corner of the showroom, Greg observed the two friends with barely concealed irritation. He crossed his arms, his posture stiff with authority he had no right to wield. The presence of James, who exuded confidence and success, only seemed to fuel Greg's disdain further. Looks like he brought someone to do the talking for him, Greg remarked to a colleague, loud enough for Thomas to hear. His words elicited a few quiet chuckles from the crowd. Thomas clenched his jaw but remained silent, his fists tightening momentarily at his sides. James, however, was not one to let such remarks slide. He turned to Greg, his voice calm but piercing. If I recall correctly, your job is to sell airplanes, not to judge the people interested in buying them. Greg smirked, unfazed. And if I recall correctly, this isn't the kind of place people like him can afford, he said, gesturing toward Thomas. We deal with serious buyers, not? Enough, Thomas interrupted, his voice firm and commanding. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Thomas stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Greg. I've worked hard my entire life, he began, his tone measured but resolute. What I wear or how I look doesn't change the fact that I have every right to be here. Your judgment doesn't define me. For a moment, Greg faltered, caught off guard by the quiet strength in Thomas's words. But the sneer returned quickly, as if he refused to acknowledge the possibility of being wrong. Prove it, Greg said, crossing his arms again. Let's see if you can actually back up that talk. Before Thomas could respond, James stepped in. He doesn't need to prove anything to you, he said sharply. The only thing that needs proving here is whether this company can treat its customers with basic respect. Greg opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of a clearing throat interrupted him. A woman in a smart business suit had entered the room, her sharp gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd. It was clear from her demeanor that she held a position of authority. Is there a problem here? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Greg stiffened, the confidence draining from his face. No problem, ma'am, he said quickly. The woman turned to Thomas and James, her expression softening slightly. Can I help you gentlemen with something? Thomas straightened, meeting her gaze. I'm here to buy a plane, he said simply. She nodded, unfazed by his appearance. Of course. Let me show you the models we have available. But before they could move forward, a voice from the crowd interrupted. He's wasting your time, said a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, his tone dripping with condescension. He's probably here just to take pictures and dream. The woman's expression hardened, but before she could respond, Thomas spoke again. Dreaming isn't a crime, he said, his voice steady. And turning those dreams into reality is something I've spent my entire life doing. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Even those who had been mocking him moments before seemed taken aback by the conviction in his voice. James placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Let's focus on what we came here to do, he said quietly. The woman led them toward the jet Thomas had admired earlier, detailing its specifications and features. Her professionalism stood in stark contrast to the judgmental stares that still lingered in the background. As Thomas ran his hand along the control panel of the jet, imagining the possibilities it represented, Greg lingered nearby, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't ready to let this go. "Do you even know the price of this plane?" Greg called out, his voice laced with mockery. "Or are you just pretending you can afford it?" Thomas turned slowly, his gaze steady. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a check and held it up for everyone to see. The room gasped collectively as the amount became clear. It was enough to cover the full cost of the jet. "I don't need to pretend," Thomas said, his voice calm but cutting. "And I don't need your validation." The room fell into stunned silence. Greg's face paled, his earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. The middle-aged man who had mocked Thomas earlier shifted uneasily, avoiding eye contact. Thomas handed the check to the woman, who accepted it with a nod. "We'll prepare the necessary paperwork," she said, her tone respectful. Turning back to the crowd, Thomas spoke one final time. "To everyone who doubted me, your judgment doesn't define me. My actions do. And today, I've proven that I belong anywhere I choose to be." James smiled proudly as the two friends walked toward the reception desk to finalize the purchase. The oppressive weight of prejudice in the room had lifted, replaced by an air of quiet respect. But Thomas knew this wasn't the end of the battle. The fight against prejudice and judgment wasn't won in a single moment. It was a lifelong journey. Days after Thomas had purchased his dream jet, the story of his treatment at the showroom began to spread. What started as whispers in the local community soon turned into a public outcry, amplified by social media. People were enraged by the blatant discrimination Thomas had faced, and his son, Marcus, a successful lawyer, decided it was time to take action. Marcus met his father at their family home, the weight of the recent events heavy on both their minds. "Dad," Marcus said, placing a reassuring hand on Thomas's shoulder, "this isn't just about what happened to you. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." Thomas nodded, his resolve clear. "I don't want revenge," he said quietly. "I just want respect, for me and for anyone else who's been treated like they don't belong." With that, Marcus began building a legal case. Over the next few weeks, he gathered evidence, contacted witnesses, and documented every detail of the incident. Patricia, the showroom employee who had secretly recorded the discriminatory remarks, came forward with her testimony and the recordings, which proved to be a pivotal piece of evidence. The case garnered significant attention, and soon, the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and spectators. Marcus stood confidently before the judge, his sharp suit and piercing gaze commanding the room's attention. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady and deliberate, "we are here today to address not just the humiliation my father endured, but the systemic prejudice that allows such behavior to persist in public businesses." He presented the recordings Patricia had provided. The courtroom listened intently as the mocking voices echoed through the speakers. "Do you think you can buy a plane dressed like that? Go back to your farm. It suits you better. Probably thinks this is a charity giveaway." Each statement was a dagger, cutting through the air and leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. Thomas sat in the plaintiff's chair, his expression calm but resolute, while Greg and the company's representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The defense attorney attempted to downplay the incident. "Your Honor," she said, standing to address the court, "while the remarks made by individual employees were inappropriate, they do not reflect the company's policies or values. This was an isolated incident, not a systemic issue." Marcus didn't flinch. He rose from his seat, holding up a stack of documents. "Your Honor," he countered, "these are internal reports and employee testimonials that show a pattern of similar incidents. This isn't an isolated case. It's a culture of discrimination fostered by this company." The judge leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mr. Marcus, proceed." Marcus called Patricia to the stand. Her testimony was clear and unwavering. "I've worked at the showroom for years," she said, her voice firm. "Discrimination like this happens regularly. Employees and even customers feel entitled to judge and mock anyone who doesn't fit their image of a typical buyer." Her words resonated with the courtroom, and the defense attorney visibly struggled to mount a rebuttal. In his closing statement, Marcus addressed the court with a powerful blend of emotion and logic. My father walked into that showroom with the dream of owning a jet, a dream he worked tirelessly to achieve. He wasn't judged for his ability or his character. He was judged for his appearance and his background. This isn't just about him. It's about the countless others who face similar prejudice every day. It's time we hold those responsible accountable. The judge deliberated briefly before delivering her verdict. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimonies, it is clear that Mr. Thomas was subjected to discriminatory treatment. This behavior is unacceptable in any business environment and violates basic principles of human dignity and equality. She ordered the company to pay a substantial fine of $500,000, a portion of which would go toward programs promoting diversity and inclusion. Additionally, the company was mandated to implement anti-discrimination training for all employees under the supervision of an independent body. Lastly, the judge required the company to issue a public apology to Thomas, acknowledging their wrongdoing. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the verdict was announced. Thomas turned to Marcus, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "You did it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "We did it, Dad. This isn't just for us. It's for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the pair, cameras flashing incessantly. Marcus addressed them briefly, his words carrying the weight of their victory. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. Today, we've taken a step toward a world where everyone is treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. Months later, Thomas returned to the same airport, this time as the proud owner of his new jet. He walked confidently through the showroom, now a transformed space where employees greeted every customer with genuine respect. Greg, no longer employed there, was a stark reminder of the consequences of prejudice. As Thomas boarded his plane, Marcus by his side, he reflected on the journey that had brought him there. The struggles, the judgment, and the fight for justice had not only fulfilled his dream, but also paved the way for change. As the jet soared into the sky, it symbolized more than just Thomas's success. It represented resilience, dignity, and the power of standing up against injustice.